Howdy folks. Today we're going to talk about pseudo classes. And pseudo classes are kind of an interesting feature of CSS that lets you take action based on some kind of meta attributes of the elements that you're working with. So I'm gonna work with just to show you what a pseudo class is and how it operates. I'm gonna start with hover because that's a pretty common one. So let's say we have a div here and we have some content in it. And then we have a paragraph with some content as well. Reload that, we can see our content here. So a pseudo class, if you have your normal class would be with a dot. So dot class name, and it would do some styles. The pseudo class is with a colon. So if I say div colon hover, that means any div that has this pseudo class attached to it. And I'm going to make a background color on it. So what that means is as soon as I move the mouse over that div, then it gets that red background. And that's because that pseudo class becomes active as soon as I hover over it, not until. So when you add a normal class to an element, it's always on there. So if I put class equals some class, this class is always going to be here unless I take action to remove it in JavaScript or with some other action, but the developer, the code, has to take action to remove this. The hover or any other pseudo class can actually be added and removed based on the user and the user taking some action. So like this pseudo class hover gets added to the element when I move my mouse over it. And so this is a way to kind of give your page some interaction that it may not have had before without using JavaScript, just based on the ability to add the pseudo classes. Important thing about pseudo classes is they don't actually need an element. Oftentimes you will say hover or like some element hover, and that's because you want to target specifically, but you can just do this. And if you do, you notice the whole thing becomes hoverable. So that actually adds a hover to the body as well because it applies to every single tag. And so as soon as I hover over the body, it'll become red. This will become important later on when we get to the structure classes. But most often with hover, like you can see if I do this with hover, it's kind of useless. So more often what I'm going to want to do is put it on a div and maybe on the paragraph as well. And then you can see it hovers appropriately between the two. You might also be noticing when I hover all the way out here, it's still counting as a hover. That's because divs and paragraphs are block level elements, so they take up the full width of their parent, which means you can see in that little blue section there, the div does take up all the way to the end. So if I hover over that end, that's still part of the div. It's not just this text that I have to hover over. So let's look at the four kinds of pseudo selectors. So there are input pseudo selectors, or pseudo classes, excuse me, location pseudo classes, structure pseudo classes, and action pseudo classes. Generally, the most common ones you're going to be using are structure and action, but the input ones are interesting as well. So we could have those checkbox, some checkbox here, right? And this can have a couple of styles on it. So if I say input checked, then that is a style. Well, I guess you can't see it because the background gets messed with. Let's do this. Let's use um let's use a sibling selector. We've actually done this in class. So you can see as soon as this becomes checked, as soon as this pseudo class adds onto that div or this input, it's going to take effect and match this selector. There's a couple more. So type text. This one I know will work. So you can actually disable or enable an element just by saying disabled. think you could just do it like this. Let's double check. And there's also a pseudo selector for that. So you can see that is red. If I put this one in here, oops, it would not be red. There's also an enabled selector. Blue. So you can see this one is enabled. I can type in it. Type. It's kind of not very visible. Blue is not a good background for this unless you change your text color too. But this one I actually can't click on. I can't type in it. The others that are kind of useful is if you have an email, for instance. An email field, let's actually do this. Do a break line here. So an email field, make my text actually legible here, takes an email. So instructors.2u.com, that's a valid email. If I just do this, that's not a valid email. The email field recognizes that that's not valid, and you can actually check on that. So you can say, we're going to do an attribute selector here, email, invalid. And then we can change the background color to something like green. So then if we go in here, you can see this is not an email, but now it is a valid email. And there's also the valid selector as well that does something very similar. And we'll make that purple just because I'm starting to run out of colors. So you see empty starts out this way, goes to green, some stuff. And so you can use this. There's a bunch of different input types that there's emails, there's numbers, there's phone numbers. And the browser will actually be able to tell you whether or not it's valid based on this. And this can be kind of nice because as the user is typing, we could do some JavaScript to verify, oh, is this a valid email? Is this not? But the browser already knows what a valid email looks like, so we can actually use these pseudo classes to do some validation on that. So those are input pseudo classes. So the next set of pseudo classes that we have are the location pseudo classes. And these are for anchor tags. So if we say anchor href, yes, www.google.com, Google, and you look in here, I've been to this link already. So what I can do is I can style it with the visited pseudo class. Now, an important thing to note is the visited pseudo class is actually kind of limited in what it can do. So if I set a background color on it, and we look at this, you can see it actually does show up. In here, the fact that this block shows up here tells you that this this selector matches, but the background color is not applying. However, if I put a color, you can see that does change. And that's because this is for security purposes. It's possible, like let's say if I'd actually put, oh, this is Google, you can totally go to Google, and then I changed a bunch of stuff about it to make it look completely unrecognizable, I might trick someone into clicking a link that they wouldn't otherwise click on. So there's a limitation to the amount of things that you can add onto this. Visited is the big one because this is kind of what styles this stuff. If you're trying to make a link that doesn't underline the text, you could actually say anchor tag and then say text decoration none, color inherit, and that would actually, if I have a link to somewhere that I've never been before, that's not a valid link actually. You can see now that shows up like this, but you can notice that this one still has this color. So a lot of times you also want to put the a.visited just to make sure, and just to make sure that you're catching all of these and turning all these off. This is also kind of part of reset. So the next part is the structure classes, and these are complicated. There's a lot of them. The ones I'm going to go over are not the only ones that exist. So there's a bunch others. The first one is the root. And you remember from variables, we had we actually use this for variables, right? And what root does, root is actually a pseudo class. Like you can see, it's got the colon here. And I could put it on a div, for instance, right? So I could have a div here, content. The thing is, a div will never have the root pseudo class attached to it. The only thing that will ever have the root pseudo class is the actual root element. So then if I look at the HTML, you can see HTML, the HTML tag, is the only thing that will ever have this attached to it. So you can see it still shows up here. So then why don't we say HTML colon root? It's just to save us some typing. You remember if we had hover and we changed the background color to red, it basically did it for every single element ever. And so it's kind of not super useful to do this sort of a thing. However, for the root, we know this can only ever be applied to one element, and that's the HTML. No other element will ever get that pseudo class, so it's perfectly okay to leave it off. And it also just kind of, you see colon root here without the HTML, it just lets you know, hey, something's different about this, something's up. And it's a nice little visual cue to let you know. So the root is for stuff that goes only on the HTML or root of the document and will cascade down into everything else. So you can see this root is now inherited. And that's actually kind of the difference between the pseudo class root and the universal selector. So root will inherit, meaning it's overridable. So I'll actually give you a little bit of a thing on that. So we have class equal social content, and then we just put some content here. If I actually make put a background on the root, and I say background color is red, but then I specifically take this actually, let's put this here. This div here, and I say, okay, except for special. Special is going to have a background color of green. And I go here, you can see that special does in fact get that background color of green, whereas everything else gets the red, because the body here actually inherits its background from that HTML element, from the root. It's an inherited style. But this one ignores it because it has its own style. However, if I make this a universal selector, you notice that content now also becomes red because I have this background color on special, but the universal selector for a specific element overrides what it's getting from its parent. So it would be getting the green as a inherit from its parent, but it's got the universal selector, which is more specific, so it loses that. So that's kind of what the difference between root and the universal selector are. Let's go into a couple other cases of these. We have empty content, and then we have, and let's do this. We're going to say div width 100 pixel, height 100 pixel, background color green, just to start off with. So you can see here now we actually have this empty div and this filled div. They're both 100 by 100. If we set the background color of the empty one to red, then you can see it actually becomes red because it has no content in it. And so that content includes text, that includes other elements. So if I was to put another div in here, oh no, I guess it is text. So we have some stuff in here. You can see this now becomes this because it actually has some displayable content. The next one is nth child. Nth child is really interesting. So let's say we have a section. We have content 1, and I'm just going to copy this a couple times. 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I'm going to say div nth child 1. And I'm going to set its background color to red. Otherwise, other divs are going to have their background color be green. I like Christmas colors. So you can see this particular one gets this nth child of 1 because it is the first child. This is a little different from any other, when you get into arrays in JavaScript or any other programming language, they will start from 0. Well, nth child starts from 1 because of just how it's set up. You can do a lot of things with this. You can do even, which does only the even rows. You can do odd. You can actually do formulas. So you can put n in a formula. I don't think that actually works. But where n basically becomes the specific number that you're looking at. So like every 2n. It's a little complicated how this nth child works. So definitely take a look at it, but it's useful if you're like, I want to change simply the fourth element of this to do something a little different. There's also a couple other ones that are useful. First child, which is always the first one. Last child, which is always the last one, which can be kind of useful if you want to only, like maybe you're dealing with something that you want to have a special little cap. Like maybe your last child, you also want to have a border radius of, let's see. I don't think I put those in right, but okay, yeah, there you go. So you want your last one to have some rounded borders, and you also want your first one to have some rounded borders maybe, but rounded on the top. We could do first child and then just reverse the order here. And there you can see you've got some nice rounded borders, even though these are all different elements. So that's something you can do with that. Something to bear in mind. Last child, first child, nth child, all of these apply to the child itself. They don't apply, so you don't say section last child. Oops. Child. This applies to the div. It says, is this div the last child? Not, does this div have the last child? Or referencing the last child. It's an attribute of the element itself. There's also only child. And what that does is that says, okay, am I the only child? So if I put another section down here with only one content, you can see, well, let's actually do a line between them. You can see because this one is the only child of its section, of its parent, it gets this style applied to it. There's also nth of type. And let me just double check on what that does. I think it's exactly the based on their position on siblings among the same. Okay, yeah. So nth of type is a filter. So if this was an article, for instance, then div nth child 1 is going to be this one and this one, which is a little weird and not completely intuitive, right? But it's because, because I put these all inside the article. See? One little change. It's going to be this one, and if I do nth child 2, it's just not going to show up at all for that first section because the second child is not a div. The second child, the next child that's a div is actually the third one. However, if I do nth of type, then you can see that this one, even though it's a third child, it's the second div child, which actually shows up. You also have the similar first of type, which if I put this article first, you can see it's that first div that still shows up. I'm going to actually just get rid of this. There's also last of type, and also only of type. So if I actually put this on the article only of type, and I set this to yellow, you can see that article lights up now because it's the only article in this section. If I suddenly add another article, and I call it article 2, it no longer has that style because there are additional articles. So this can be really helpful in a lot of cases. First child, last child, only child, of course, but nth of type is also, let's say that you're saying, okay, I got a link and I want to style the first link in a paragraph, but there's a bunch of other stuff in there. So you can say nth of type for the anchor tag, and it'll get that first link, or first of type, last of type. So it's kind of if you got a mixed bag like we've got here and they're all jumbled everywhere, you could manually look up or use some clever JavaScript to figure out where that first one is and use nth child. But this just makes it a little easier so the browser will figure that out for you. All right. And so the last chunk here are the action classes, which we kind of already went over. Structure classes are where something lives in the DOM. Location classes is basically for links. Input classes is a user typing into inputs. Action classes are the two main ones are active and hover, or hover and hover and active. So um actually let's just use this. So we can have a button and we could add some states to it. So if we say hover, let's change the color to blue. So now if I hover over this, it changes the color. You can notice it also does a couple other little nice changes to it. So if I add this hover state on it, there's a couple of other things that it does. Like it changes the background a little bit as well. Active is when it's for a button specifically, it's when it's being clicked on. And so let's change the background color to green in this case. So if I push down on it, only when I'm clicking down. As soon as I let up, it goes away. But you can see here, I hover and then I click and it actually still has the hover state on it. I can also keep holding the mouse down and let off. You can't necessarily do this on mobile, but you can do this on a browser and it will keep that active state, but not the hover. Because the hover is based on the mouse position. The active is based on where the mouse was when I clicked down, and then it kind of doesn't pay attention after that point, which can kind of be interesting. I've not actually found that to be super useful in a lot of cases, but it's kind of interesting to bear in mind. So yeah, that's hover and active. There's a couple more of these, but these are the two that you're probably going to be running into. Yeah, and I think that's pretty much it. Yeah. So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully you got a little bit better understanding of what pseudo classes are and how you use them. And yeah, I'll see you all in class.